Well, yeah, that's why I'm shooting this little test, is because the real logistics of where we can fit the camera and actually get a shot and get the scene and then sort of tell the story, which is out here somewhere.
It was amazing when George presented Phantom Menace to us. The idea that we could even do it in time or even do it at all seemed pretty much impossible. But we all just focused on it and just said, okay, let's do this, and divided the show up. The work was always conceived from the beginning to not so much do synthetic CG backgrounds, but to try to have those all be real, real locations, real miniatures that we could do some work on. But the CG was used for the characters and for the compositing. And that's, I think, was really a good way to go, because at that time we didn't really have the tools to make landscapes and all look very real. And any time, I still feel this, any time that you can start with something real, you should use it, because it forces the work up to that level. And I think that combination of the two always keeps you sort of on your toes. Is this real or is this fake? But you buy into it and you believe it.
In The Phantom Menace, we visit Naboo, which is the home planet of the Queen. And it's a critical planet because it's kind of the center of, the start of Episode 1. And for the aesthetic of it, it was really interesting because, at this time, this was before the Empire, and George really wanted to create an aesthetic where it was a mix of different styles. And in some ways, it was a lot more romantic.
Yeah, and even here, you could put ivy sort of growing up.
It's a society that's very integrated in terms of technology with nature. And once we settled on that idea, it really grounded the look of the planet.
The big battle was pretty difficult at the time, because nobody up until that time had done a synthetic battle with like thousands of soldiers or people fighting each other, creatures fighting each other. It's been done a lot since, but that was, as far as I know, it's the first time it had really been done without using real people, all computer graphics. We didn't do any sort of crowd simulations or anything like that with emotions. They were all real motion capture or hand animated characters all the time that we just replicated over and over and shifted them around a little bit so that you couldn't tell one character was moving the same way as another. But then they get into a battle and we've got all the traditional sort of more Star Wars-y type explosions and stuff like that. And we used everything we could think of. Mostly, there was a lot less computer graphics than people might think. We did a lot of stuff with real explosions, real miniature ships that you see going along on the ground that crash. We had a really nice model shop here, and at the time that seemed to be the best way to do it. And I still think it was, because it looks pretty good.
On Naboo, there is these other society, which is complementary to the Queen's world, which are the Gungans. And it was really interesting because George had this brilliant idea of creating sort of this underwater society. The Gungans actually had this technology of force fields, and they can create these bubbles underneath the ocean. And that was a really fun thing to explore, because visually it's stunning, of course, because you're literally in a world of windows. One of the wonderful challenges that George kind of laid on all of us was, okay, we're going to create something visually stunning, but he also wanted to really lay down the foundation that it had to look believable. It had to have logic and in a sense that, no, this world really could exist.
It really has to do with when you see the cut sequence. He's way down at the end of the tunnel. It's real tiny.
Yeah.
And you have to sort of say, oh, monster.
Okay.
The underwater sequence, I'd always wanted to do something like that, and especially wanted to do something with sort of that manta ray designed ship. George was pretty open and shot designs, and I came up with a lot of the stuff that showed the different size scales of the fish, how to, with ideas about how to set the shots up so that you always thought you were seeing a bigger fish, which is sort of the punchline to the entire sequence.
When I first saw the finished film, I was really thrilled. I mean, it was in many ways what we saw in our mind's eye come to life. I spent, literally years working on the planet itself, trying to design the aesthetic for it. And the execution by ILM was just flawless. I mean, it just looked great.
First off, it's an extraordinary story. It's the first story in the Star Wars cycle. And it's a great adventure story. And that's what I saw first when I read it and saw the photographs and the descriptions of these extraordinary planets and worlds that my character and various other characters explore and find themselves involved with. Second or third reading, it was, it was like, oh yeah, there is this element to it now. Of course, these races of creatures and individuals and human purposes, they all depend on each other here.
Our two great societies have always lived in peace. The Trade Federation has destroyed all that we have worked so hard to build. If we do not act quickly, all will be lost forever. I ask you to help us.
George is making a very, very strong point through entertainment of that life needs each other, you know what I mean? It's like a tree needs the ground it grows on, the ground then needs man to kind of look after it. And in fact, my character makes a statement to this little boy who becomes my apprentice. Midichlorians are a microscopic life form that resides within all living cells.
They live inside me.
Inside your cells, yes. And we are symbionts with them.
Symbionts?
Life forms living together for mutual advantage. That we wouldn't live unless we had them, and yet if we saw them under a microscope, we'd see these kind of nasty little bug-like things that your instant reaction would be to kill it, but that is life.
I don't understand.
With time and training, Annie, you will. You will. It's about harmony, I guess, but told in a wonderful, entertaining, as I say, way, and full of action and full of a very, very interesting basic philosophy that we all need to be reminded of.
That's it. Tatooine.
Tatooine is a key planet. Of course, it's where where we discover Anakin. And as it relates to the whole Star Wars universe, it's really the center of where it all starts. To actually have the opportunity to go back and build on those designs was fantastic. Of course, George wanted to push the boundaries even further, and so we took the design philosophy established by Ralph McQuarrie and others and started to really think, okay, how would this society actually function? I basically took, Luke's homestead, which is a really elegant design, and just extrapolated it out.
Tatooine's the only location in Episode 1 that we visit that's shared from the original trilogy, and so it was important to me that it still kind of feel like the same planet. Tunisia was a very difficult location, mostly because of the temperature. We ended up shooting starting end of July into the first part of August, when Anakin and Shmi are saying goodbye. That sequence, it was 126.5 degrees when we shot that scene. Those are temperatures I've never experienced before, and I hope I never experience again.
I don't think they're going to need to build anything. I mean, they need to build just a little tiny bit of the ramp on a blue screen set.
The effects work is mostly set extensions. So when the Queen ship is parked in the desert, we really just had the ramp there. Any of the wider views was an 8-foot-long miniature that we had of the ship and splitting that all in. We had set extensions inside of the Mos Espa city. The set build went up to about 12 feet, and then we extended it and made the city larger and populated it. We added droids and other creatures.
As George was writing the story, he needed a centerpiece for this big action sequence, which was this huge race, which we called the pod race. We started researching Southwest in terms of butte formations, looking at the Grand Canyon for rocks, looking literally everywhere we could find exotic rock formations in the desert, and we just merged them all together.
A lot of shots were traveling at tremendous speed, and at the beginning of a shot, something that's way on the far end, way out on the horizon, would be going past camera. So it either meant tremendously large miniatures or helicopter plates, but exotic terrains that George wanted didn't really exist anywhere. That really leaves computer graphics of some kind as about the only real solution. To begin with, we started in the hangar beforehand. We had a partial set that we shot in at Leavesden in England. And then the large pod race arena was about a 40-foot miniature that we shot out in the back lot, back at ILM, populated largely with ILM employees. It was a combination of computer-generated people and blue screen elements that we shot for mid-range shots. And then for shots in the pod race, we're actually flying through the arena. We had a bunch of colored Q-tips that were in the stands, and by playing fans across the back of it, you could get some subtle motion in the crowds that they have an appearance of being alive. George pointed out that the thing about Tatooine is the skies aren't blue, that they actually have a grayness to them. And when we were in Tunisia, he's exactly right. You have this kind of yellowish dust that gets swept up into the sky and is kind of suspended in the air. And that yellowish tone of the dust neutralizes the blue of the sky and kind of adds up to a kind of a grayish horizon. And so we tried to make sure that that was always present in the shots that we did.
It was very interesting to build 18 pod engines, the engines and the pods. Well, the engines are the size of 747 engines. I mean, they're just huge. They're 20, 25, 30 feet long, 12 to 15 feet wide, which is over the maximum that any truck is allowed to take. And that becomes immediately a challenge. And it's also something we could never have done in the heat of Tunisia. It just would have been impossible. I think all of the engines took about 12 weeks to build. To have that kind of crew working in that kind of environment would have been very, very difficult. And it was much easier to build them and then transport them. The transport was fantastic, though. It was a really major thing. We could only drive at night. We had ferries that we had to put them on. We even flew a lot of the engines in a Russian MTV 800, which is the largest transport plane in the world. That was a lot of fun. Well, one of the problems about Episode 4, A New Hope, was that none of the records really remained for Tunisia. They hadn't had an opportunity to really find all the locations before they went there. They were on the move from the main part of Tunisia to a little island called Jerba, and no one had kept accurate records of where every single location was. And since we were not replicating them, but we were going to be in the same world, we wanted to try and find an area that would be much simpler than Episode 4 was to shoot. And we needed to find an area that would combine all the elements of all the disparate locations that they went to. As it turned out, there was a very interesting article that had been given to me at Lucasfilm about a young guy who was getting his PhD. He was an archaeologist, and he decided to make archaeology very fun. So his thesis was written on where were the original locations on Episode 4. And as soon as I read it, I realized he was the only guy. He'd spent months and months in the desert tracking down every single location. So I called him up. He was a really nice guy. And we sent him out to Tunisia, and we met him there. He immediately proceeded to show us where all the locations, because all of us were obviously not on the original Star Wars. When we were traveling with David throughout all the areas, there was one little section in Jerba whereas the main cantina was, and it had been rebuilt. It was a brand new modern street. I mean, there were basically condominiums surrounding it, and there was no way to actually picture where the original cantina was. But David knew precisely where it was because he had been there years before, and we were trying to talk to someone, and he took us into his garden. And as we were walking into his house, we saw one of the original cupolas in his garden, which he was now growing vegetables in. And we suddenly started to discover pieces, and we found the actual original cantina door about a quarter of a mile away, and it was being used as a door to protect a chicken farm. It was just fantastic, absolutely fantastic. We saw it in the middle of nowhere. So there were little pieces, and we saw an older man, maybe in his late 80s, walking down the street with the original Star Wars t-shirt, and I didn't have the heart to tell him that that was probably worth $10,000 now.
Coruscant is the sort of the home planet of the Republic at this point. It's the center planet. It's basically a planet made entirely of cities.
Since there's really no locations you can go shoot, everything you see has to be fabricated. And it was a combination of partial sets and a lot of miniatures and computer graphics, matte paintings, kind of every technique we could throw at it.
It was an interesting design challenge in the sense that, how do you create this world that's completely built out and yet still make it kind of, attractive so that it becomes the symbol of power in the Republic? Where you start to look not sort of at an individual building level, but at a planetary level, where you start really looking at it and treating each city as if it was one particular building and how would it flow out.
We had experimented a little bit with the look of Coruscant, actually, for one of the end shots of the Return of the Jedi Special Edition. We have a series of vignettes of celebrations happening, and one of them is a little glimpse of Coruscant.
So what we did was we started to go with monumental styles, architecture that we're very familiar with, stone architecture, classic architectures, forms that we're very familiar with in New York. Taking those forms and then literally multiplying them by 1,000, if not more, and just exaggerating the scale. What you're seeing rings familiar, but yet the scale is of such a crazy proportion that it kind of makes your jaws drop and say, wow, this society must be pretty amazing to build structures of this scale.
A major feature of the planet is this constant strings of flying traffic. So everywhere you look, there's these lanes of flying cars. Weren't real hard to do. Probably about 20 or so different vehicle designs with color variations in them, and then they're assembled into lanes of traffic, and then those lanes of traffic got reused over and over again, going different directions. We would do occasional sweeteners. When you saw crossed strings of traffic, we would animate a couple of vehicles that would change lanes, go from one string to another. So you can occasionally see that in the background. Probably the biggest challenge dealing with Coruscant is getting enough variety. You don't want to see the same building over and over again. You want to see consistent architectural themes, but it needs to look like every building is unique. There were probably about 24 different distinct 3D models that we built. Buildings that were repurposable, that you could take pieces off of them and assemble them in different ways, and that turned 90 degrees, it would look a little bit different, or you could have lights on one and not on another, and those got painted on top of to make more complete skylines.
One of the really fun environments to design was the Jedi Temple. George wanted something very monumental, but he also wanted something very spiritual. And so we came up with the idea that it was going to be these 5 giant towers, and the Jedi Council being in the top of the very center one. It's in some ways almost religious. And if you think about it, you have this vast planet, and yet the Jedi Temple is on top of that, and they have the highest point looking down. The counterpoint, that the Senate chamber was going to be more like a big mushroom dome, and then it's all internal. Everything is on the inside part of it. And so you have these two contrasting forms, a very vertical sort of spiritual aerial place countered with the sort of a dome, almost cave-like environment for the Senate chamber.
One of my favorite things about the Coruscant scenes are at night when you see way off in the distance. We did this nice heat shimmer effect that you see in big cities. Heat shimmer that would be visible as a twinkling of the lights, and we did that in the nighttime scene in the Jedi Council chamber, the landing platform when they depart to head back home. And then there's a nighttime scene in Palpatine's apartment that we put that in. I was pleased with how that effect turned out, and it did a lot to help add depth to the backgrounds. The Palpatine's apartment set was notable just because it was the very first thing we shot on the first day of principal photography on episode 1.
Good luck, everybody. Now let's kick ass. 77, take 1.
And action!
So after a gap from 1982 to 1997, that was our first rolling of cameras on Star Wars.
Doing the Star Wars films is, every time you do one, it's like a new adventure. It's like running the Indy 500 every year. I mean, just every time you do it, even no matter how many times you've done it, it's the same challenge. And there's no guarantee that you're going to be able to pull it off at all. When I do these three, then it's finished. I've kind of done the story, and I feel I've accomplished what I set out to do originally, even more so, because what I really set out to do was the first three. I didn't even think I would get the first three done until after the films came out. And then when the films came out, I realized not only could I finish the other two, but I could also tell a backstory if I really wanted to, because that's a good story. It's fun to go back into that world. I get to do a lot of things now that I couldn't do before, which is going to be exciting in terms of writing and stuff. I can create things that weren't possible to create before. I was always, and I will be on this, but I've always been sort of at the limit of what is possible in terms of storytelling. Things have advanced so far in the last 20 years in terms of your ability to portray things on the screen that were just literally impossible before, and then very difficult in terms of cost. It's always a limiting factor. But even if you take that out, there were things that just couldn't be done regardless of how much money you had. One of the problems I had with Yoda is that, for instance, is that he couldn't move more than 6 feet in any one thing, and I couldn't show his legs. So I couldn't show him in a wide shot, and I couldn't show him running, jumping, or walking, really, any distance. We had to sort of rig backpacks and things to make him, to be able to transport him places. Now I can make him move anywhere I want. It's a great asset to be able to have a lot of the creatures that couldn't move before be able to move. So I hopefully will be able to get closer to what I am putting down on the page and what I imagine things to be like. The process of writing is not easy. And it takes a great deal of concentration, and you get into a particular place and you stay there for a while, and then you get, as you move around in that world, you can sort of see the things that are going on. And it's not something you can pop in and out of that easily. You know, I'm sort of running the story over in my mind all the time, and sort of contemplating various scene fits. What would it be like if we did this? What if I started there? What if, because there's point of view, there's a lot of mechanics that have to happen. And then there's, the entertainment values, which is, is it funny? Does it move things forward? Is it exciting? All those kinds of issues. So I'm finally glad to be working on my own again. It's great to be able to sit by myself and just do this. It's like a real luxury, actually. And, I don't feel a lot of pressure. It's kind of fun. I mean, I'm getting to do a lot of research, which I love to do, and I'm getting a chance to think. Things are quiet. It's very contemplative, and it's a great change from where I've been.